children to grow up fearful because that impacts everything about them, including their innocence, but just literally how long they will live. Dr. Keisha Bentley Edwards actually, she has a study out of Duke where they looked at infant mortality associated with a mom's race and her educational level. And us as physicians, our child is twice as likely to die than a white woman with a third grade education. Mm-hmm. And we have every resource at our fingertips as far as our best friends are.
No, just because we're Black. And it doesn't matter that we're a physician. We have the same problem.
Why is that? Because when we're looking at in white women who have our same level of degrees, our child is 5 to 7 times more likely to die than theirs. And she said that there's a cost to be in the room when you're the only one. There's a cost. And that touched me in a place that I can't even begin to describe, because it makes me fearful to have a child. It makes it a very emotionally daunting thing, and mental health is physical health in that activation of this axis.
We've always been the only one in the room. We're still stressed out. Not that other people are not. This is not to take away from others' experiences, but it's to say, I get what you're saying.
And oftentimes if I'm getting those moments, I literally would just stand in the mirror and say, who are you? And I remember I stand on the backs of greats. They overcame everything that's humanly possible, and they not only survived, but they thrived. I am their greatest dream. And so that's why I'm so vocal, so that when my children come along, they won't have to question their worth. They'll know it from day one, because I will be there to tell it.
We often get through these tough times, but those scars will remain.
We don't talk enough about PTSD. What is this sort of compounding type of pressure doing to maybe high-risk folks mentally and physically? Can you talk to us about that?
You're absolutely right. We know the letters PTSD, but we don't truly understand the impact. And so when we think about it, more focus is usually given to the things we can see on a chart. I know we have cancer. I know my diabetes level. And then we push our mental health needs to the background, and it doesn't go away. We don't know what the end point is. We don't know if there's going to be a second wave. And so we truly don't understand the full impact of what is coming, neither physically or emotionally. So both need to be addressed at the same time to reduce both of those risks.
And if I can just maybe complicate that a little bit more, we're also in the midst of a Black Lives Matter sort of resurgence or awareness, right? So how does all of that go together? PTSD, Black Lives Matter, and then the fact that African Americans, we tend to have these higher risk conditions. Phyllis, what are your thoughts?
Well, I keep thinking it's a perfect storm because we are also more likely in communities of color, Black folks, Hispanics, to be in essential jobs. We have to make decisions about, do I go to work? And do I go to work if I'm not feeling well? Does it mean I lose my job? Which further exacerbates your mental health, anxiety, depression, and or your physical health, because often healthcare is tied to your work. So I think they find themselves in a midst of a relentless perfect storm.
My nieces and nephews, they're growing up in this age of social media, of where every single day it seems that there's some image of Black people dying, being murdered. Fear is one thing when it doesn't have any foundation, but what we know is that Black men, 1 in every 1,000 as far as police encounters, 1 in every 1,000 has a lifetime risk of being killed in that encounter. And I tell my nephew, I can't offer you up as a sacrifice for America to figure it out. We should have figured it out before George Floyd. We should have got it with Eric Garner. We should have got it with Trayvon Martin. We should have got it with Emmett Till. We should have got it with Martin Luther King.
What does it do to someone's mind or body when you're living in fear, justifiable fear? What does that do to us?
Well, there's so many unequivocal studies showing just how traumatizing this is. These are physiologic reactions that are set up to help us stay safe. And if our body is constantly looking around wondering whether we're safe or not, then we're going to be constantly in that fight or flight response, which is really terrible for our physiology, for our psychology, for everything.
And, what about, because Ebony, you mentioned the fact that literally, and it was such a graphic image came to my mind when you said it, when you said literally every day we see a Black person dying on TV. We see this imagery. Dr. Brewer, seeing this repetitively, what does that do?
So I think the official term for this is vicarious trauma. And so, direct trauma, somebody has something happen to them, but vicarious is where they're seeing this happen. And so it's kind of a secondary, but the effects can still be the same because they're wondering, hey, am I safe? So the effect is still the same, whether it's happening to somebody directly or whether they're witnessing this all the time. And the more it happens, the more it gets laid down as, wow, this is really not a safe situation.
What we know is that constant stress, chronic stress, is linked to cancers. It's linked to, which we know that African Americans have higher death rates at younger ages. We know that it is linked to cardiovascular disease, to neurovascular disease, to diabetes, to preterm labor, to increased infant mortality.
Skin color is more a marker of chronic stress than anything else. If you think about all the microaggressions that happen all the time, that's chronic stress, to a T.
Racial health disparities existed far before COVID-19.
We were all created equally. However, we don't all have equal status when it comes to our healthcare. I mean, African Americans are more likely to have hypertension and diabetes and heart disease. We have higher cancer rates, more serious cancer. We have a lower life expectancy.
By nearly a decade.
Right. Like just by virtue of being Black, you're likely to live less, for fewer years. It literally makes my blood boil. What are some things that you feel have played a role in these racial disparities and why we're at this place?
African Americans have higher death rates for 8 of the 13 leading causes of death, right? But when you're looking at the social determinants of health, you can't talk about hypertension and diabetes if you're not talking about the fact that in the 1930s, when we're discussing redlining and the way we are forming districts of which communities that Black people were allowed to live in, did they have healthy food made available to them? Are we dealing with where you have to go shopping at the local corner store? You can't talk about obesity if you don't address the fact that most Black and brown and high density population communities don't have sidewalks or any space of which you can have physical activity. You can't talk about asthma and chronic bronchitis and even cancers without the influence of industrial pollutions and the fact that in certain zip codes, it's a licensing and a permission for these industries to plant themselves within someone's backyard and spill that into the air and water source. Look at Flint, Michigan, right?
Right.
You can't even.
And why is that still an issue? Sorry to talk over.
How is that still?
Why is there still? Yeah. Why is Flint, Michigan still Flint, Michigan? How many years has it been?
How? And this was and that is the tragedy in all of this. We knew we were filling babies with lead-filled, heavy, poisonous water that looked like mud when it went out, and you looked at a child's face and said, "But it's okay for you." I have a deep problem with that. And it's one that makes me hesitate not to speak truth to what it is and call it what it is, which is systemic racism.
Thank you. Wait. Hold on. You got to, I am so glad you said that because I feel a lot of times I've been using that word when I talk about the racial disparities in health, especially with coronavirus, when I talk on the news. Systemic racism has to be talked about in this context.
It is everything. It's the systemic racism that feeds into literally every sector of what we define as social determinants of health.
You mentioned systemic racism, which is important, but we also have a troubled history with healthcare in this country. Look at Tuskegee. I have patients who still bring up Tuskegee, where, we had a healthcare system that decided that it was okay to experiment and put Black lives at risk. And basically sort of prioritize which lives are more important than others. And of course, we have a history of doing that in this country. It's a whole sea of stuff. And it's kind of like, well,
What do you do?
Not that, yeah. What do you do? And when so many things have been stacked against us, and you said it's almost like we've been victims in many ways, in these things that we're talking about.
Right. And I take it past victims and say targets.
Targets. You're right.
Tuskegee ended in 1972, just 10 years before I was born, for perspective. And when we're talking about Tuskegee, we can't mention the distrust that was built there without mentioning Flint, Michigan. That is a recent time of where, again, the government is telling Black and brown people that it's okay, trust us, when we can look at it and tell a bird is a bird and a cat is a cat, and this is not okay. Despite the hardships that they've been put through and I've been put through, is that we are, I feel like, the greatest patriots. One of the things that I always try to reinforce is that keep the voice that you have. Keep saying the things that you've said, because what we know for sure is that the power of the Black voice, you literally, with marching the streets, were able to change the very constitution of the greatest nation of this world. That's who you have in you. That's who we are.
The concept of community is only more and more important, in particular in your nexus of control and your feelings of control, and in your outlook.
Let's move on to the community pillar. What did you find with this?
Community well-being is really about how you interact and how you perceive the community or city that you live in. The concept of community is only more and more important, in particular in your nexus of control and your feelings of control, and in your outlook. The two things that we pulled out around community that were really critical: those individuals who identify as Black or African American compared to individuals who identify only as white or Caucasian, 1.5 times more likely to strongly disagree that the city that they live in is the perfect place for them. They were almost 2 times more likely to strongly agree that they have received recognition for improving or helping the city or community where they live in. And that juxtaposition really stuck out to us.
Right. No, it is kind of interesting, and it'll be interesting to see how, as you mentioned, as you collect more data and you start looking at trends and things to see what other information you find.
Absolutely.
Growing up in medicine, what I've realized is that racial health disparities has always been, since literally the beginning and the founding of America.
One of the things that we're talking about today that I think is so important is this element of race, sort of health disparities, racial health disparities, and then coronavirus. Racial disparities, period, are not new. And then when it comes to health, they are not new either. And coronavirus has like ripped the Band-Aid off of them. How do you feel about all this?
So racial health disparities actually led me into medicine in the first place. When I was 8 years old, my little sister asked my mom, can we have a brother, right? I'm the middle of 3 girls. And it was at that time that my mom told us for the first time that my parents' first child was actually a little boy. And she went into labor when she was 6 months pregnant, and he lived for 3 days and passed away. That was the first time I ever remember my mom crying at all. And so here was this woman who was the keystone of our family. To see her being weak left an impression on me that said, I want to be a doctor, although I don't know what that person does. I'm going to be one so that I can hopefully help someone else not to have the same experience. And so when we're talking about racial data collection, it's not uniform across the board. It's still not held as being important. And that's where I have the biggest problems. You know, when you're thinking about who is an American, it is Black and brown people. It is, you know, Muslims and Christians. It is those that are in the elite and those that are literally trying to scrape up pennies to feed themselves. We're all American. And until we have a uniform practice and a system that's held responsible to taking care of all those individuals, we won't be the best that we could possibly be.